Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Metagame Book Club Track 1 this time. So I'm filling in for for Kay, doing the intro for Track 1. So this is Week 2, Narratology versus Ludology. So as always for Track 1, we'll have Sherry talk about what is narratology and what is ludology and how they might actually differ.
All right, thank you for the awesome intro, Chris. Okay, I think you will be forwarding those slides for me, so I'll just tell you next, and you can forward that for me. Okay, guys, so this is Track 1 Game Studies, and we are incredibly already in Week 2. And the topic for this week is narratology versus ludology. Because of the richness of the material, I think today's presentation will focus on narratology because I suspect that due to last week's reading, you have an inkling of what ludology is, okay? So let's see. So Chris, if you can go to that next slide there with the game studies text. Okay, you're there. Okay, good. So this week we have 5 specific readings. And I wrote 6, but because one of them is actually a PDF with slides. So the first one is Beyond Myth and Metaphor, The Case of Narrative and Digital Media by Marie-Laure Ryan. This one is very influential because Marie-Laure pitted narratology against a ludologist, or accusing ludologists of not considering narrative. So this is a big one. The next one is Ludology Meets Narratology, Similitude and Differences Between Video Games and Narrative by Gonzalo Fresca. Gonzalo Fresca and Jasper Jewell are considered the prominent ludologists in the field. So when you think ludology, you think of Fresca and you think of Jewell. The next one, naturally, I would assign Games Telling Stories, A Brief Note on Games and Narratives by Jasper Jewell. And then you have one from Janet H. Murray, the famous author of Hamlet on the Holodeck. And she actually chimed in on this debate because she was the keynote speaker in 2005, and her keynote was called The Last Word on Ludology versus Narratology. She offers a PDF and slides. And the very last set is Ludologists Love Stories 2, Notes from a Debate That Never Took Place by Gonzalo Fresca. That was his way of responding to the accusations that ludologists don't like narratives. Okay, so if you can go next for me. Okay, cool. So the very first text, again, we're going to focus on this entire presentation on Beyond Myth and Metaphor, A Case of Narrative and Digital Media. Simply because this text is so dense that I felt that to give respect to the text, you really need to dive very deep into it. So if you can go to next for me. All right. So I'm summing up the main argument by Ryan here in her paper, okay? And this is what I gather from her paper. So she argues that the software industry, so the entire software industry, which believes that computers can enhance, advance, or represent storytelling. So when I say represent, the impression that they get is that computer or digital media is a story, so that's what we mean by represent storytelling, is operating under narrative myths that promise much but are too impractical or inviable for implementation. So she's basically accusing them of presenting things that they think is narratives, but they actually are not quite there. And they think that digital media is the promise for fulfilling narrative aspirations and theories. Okay. The software industry also ignores the effect of different types of media on a narrative. So to explain this problem, she begins by offering an in-depth definition of narrative, which includes several characteristics to help us identify narrative and narrativity. Okay, so let's see, nothing bad happened. Okay, so if you can go next.
And what's laughing is Chris put in a comment that because nothing bad ever happens when stereotyping was used.
Yeah, nothing ever happens, right? All right, so we're going to keep on going with this. So anyway, we're going to start with the first definition as what is narrative. And Ryan did an excellent job putting out several characteristics, and I grabbed just a few from the text, okay? And these are the key ones. So narrativity is independent of the question of fictionality. So when we say narrative, we don't mean fiction. It can include fiction, but it doesn't have to be fiction. Narrativity is not coextensive with literature nor the novel. So when we say narrativity, we don't want to automatically think it's literature or novel, and I'll explain a bit why. So it's literature and novel are secondary factors to what narrativity is. Third, narrativity is independent of tellability. So I put in parentheses there, narrativity does not automatically mean storytelling. That's also after the fact. This is something even deeper. So remember last week we talked about what exactly is a play, right, according to Hausinger. This is one of those discussions. So play, we're not talking about it's tethered to education or tethered to any kind of purpose. Narrativity also is an idea in and of itself. It doesn't have to be tethered to these physical objects such as literature or novel or storytelling quite yet, okay? And here's the big one. So I highlighted that in yellow. A narrative is assigned with a signifier, in this case a discourse, and it's signified, which is story, mental images, semantic representations. The signifier can have many different semiotic manifestations. It can consist, for instance, of a verbal act of storytelling, otherwise known as diegetic narration, or of gestures and dialogue performed by actors, which is also known as mimetic or dramatic narration. So those are the terms from Greek terms that are used here. Now, if you can see some of the keywords, if some of you have studied semiology, you can see that sign, signifier, signify is mentioned. So Ryan is using semiotic or semiotic theory to discuss what narrative is, okay? She also says that narrativity of a text is located on the level of the signified. Narrativity should therefore be defined in semantic terms. The definition should be medium free. So because narrativity, and when we say semantic, we're talking about symbols, okay? So when narrativity is defined in semantic terms, we're talking about it as a concept, as a symbol. It is not a thing yet. So if it is a thing, it can be tethered to a medium. So when we say, for example, video game is a medium, digital media of any type like television, that's a medium. Let's see, for example, PlayStation, that's a medium, okay? We're not talking about those mediums. Narrativity should not be tethered to any of those things. In fact, literature is also a sort of medium, or a novel is a medium. We're not talking about that at all. We are talking about narrativity as a symbolic representation of something else. So, Chris, if you can go to that next slide for me. Okay. I realize how incredibly complicated the semiotics is. If you are familiar with semiotics, it shouldn't be too hard for you to understand. But if you have never studied semiotics, it's just, for a lot of people, it's over their head, and it's just very painful to go through. So I want to explain. I drew a picture, actually, a graphics, to help you guys understand what she's talking about. Okay? So according to Ryan, this is how narrative works. So she said narrative is a sign. So she's going by the definition that narrative is an abstract mental construct. So I drew that circle in the middle of the guy's head to kind of show you that it originates from the mind. So you're thinking about a sign, okay? And then when you go next, it goes to that narrativity, which is the signified. Now, when we say signified, it basically is the concept that we're talking about. So the sign is represented by these concepts. So concepts are story, mental images, or semantic representations. I put bracket on the right-hand side to show you that semantic, when we say semantic level, that means it's symbolic or conceptual, and it's, medium free. So if you can go back. Yeah, there you go. Thank you. Okay, so narrativity, signified, we're talking about conceptual. So I couldn't draw that box in the mind there, but it originated, what I'm trying to demonstrate to you is a type of thinking, okay? We're not creating anything yet. Then from the narrativity, which is a symbolic or semantic level, you go to discourse. So discourse is what we mean by signifier. So signifier is basically the object representation of the signified. So signify the concept, and when it becomes an object represented, we call that signifier. These terms came from Saussure brand of semiology. Okay. And let's see here. So there are two types that I typed in there. So Ryan used those as examples of types of discourse, okay? Diegetic narration is verbal storytelling. So you hear someone actually verbally tell you that. So that's diegetic. And mimetic narration is when you use actions or gestures to tell a story. So that refers to, for example, if you think of theater, drama, some dramas do not have any words or any dialogue, but you are supposed to interpret what's happening based on how they gesture their body. So that's mimetic. Okay, and I put on the top right where I say narrative interpretation to representation. So you can see that there are two tiers there: narrative interpretation, narrative representation. They're two separate processes. And based on interpretation, the reader constructs narrative representation that consists of setting, character, an event, or plot. So narrative representation is what most teachers will call narrative. So when we say, oh, a narrative contains, you know, a setting, character, plot, other components to narrative, you're actually talking about narrative representation. And that narrative representation is based on the reader who is making interpretation of the sign. So they're making interpretation, and then comes the narrative representation. So I hope that's clear. So, next.
No, I think your graphic is wonderful.
Okay, I hope that helped, because I thought that Ryan's text was a little bit.
And I'd say even hard. If you wouldn't mind, even put it on the Google Plus community, and you know the picture of it, and then we can ask questions or make comments too.
Sure. I was going to give out the slideshow once I finish.
Yeah. I was like, but even just this picture, it's great.
Okay.
No, and here's the reason why. Here's the reason why, because what you're talking about, we do have a lot of teachers who are using game-based learning. Mm-hmm. And they talk about it just being narrative.
Right.
And they use those kinds of terms, but quite honestly, based on the readings that we've been doing with you, there's quite a bit of ludology that they're also pulling out. But the terms they keep using keep referring back to the narrative. And I don't know if Vasili wants to jump in on that, but yeah, that's how I'm seeing a lot of instructors and teachers using game-based learning and not being able to verbalize it even to the extent of how they're using it, and kind of putting themselves in a narratology box.
Right. And just to be fair, because this is so complicated, I'm only talking about narrative today, not quite narratology yet. And narrative, it's because of cognitive science influence. Now when we say narrative in academia, we're talking about the abstract mental construct. So it's before when you say, oh, a book or a poem or a story that you've written. That's already secondary, tertiary. That's already a product based on a concept. But narrative is basically a mental construct in the way you organize the world for your understanding. It's an operator or a schema to help you make meaning of the world. So it's actually a mental construct. We're not talking about narrative representation, which is when we say a novel or a poem. That's, several tiers to narrative. Okay, so if we can go next. Okay, so she makes big arguments in this paper, and she's pretty gung-ho about these arguments. So according to Ryan, there are two narrative myths that the digital media is operating on, okay? And these are myths that, she says false. So the first one is called the myth of Aleph, and the second one is called the myth of the holodeck. And according to her, the two myths create over expectation of the degree and potentiality of the design of narrativity in digital media, meaning how expressive can digital media be, right? Based on creating digital media based on these two myths. And she is basically saying that digital media has its own problems. It is not the same type as, for example, book is a medium, poem is a medium, and when you try to translate books, physical poems, let's say, into a digital medium, meanings start to change. So it doesn't transfer 1-to-1 ratio. The medium actually affects our understanding of the content of the narrative. Okay, and this is why it says that translation problem exists when transferring narrative to computers, as digital media have their own parameters or limitations. So it imposes, it brackets the narrative. So the narrative changes meaning when you do that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and discuss those two myths in depth because those are the hardest one to understand for this text.
And I don't know if I'm jumping the gun or not, and if I may, the thing of it is that there's those of us who have created things, and I'm gonna just show just because we're doing part of this in Second Life, but I think that this would mean a lot to us because there's those of us in education who've used Second Life or other virtual worlds, and there's an expectation a lot of times when we're doing instructional design or say bringing a story into Second Life or something like that there's no limitations. That there's absolutely no limitations, and why anything that can be imagined you can do. And I'm thinking that, you know, if you can imagine it, why can't you do it? But there's parameters, and there's rules, and there's game mechanics, and stuff like that. So I am enjoying where this discussion's going.
Kay, you're so smart. You're already jumping the gun, I'm telling you.
I'm sorry.
Great setup. No, wonderful setup. You're already kind of hitting. You're gonna like that myth of holodeck when I get there. Okay, totally. We're on the same page. Yeah, I'm gonna go. So I'm gonna go first with that myth of the Aleph. If you can go next for me, Chris. Okay, so I can't really find the object, but let me show you the author's image. So that's the author. Okay, and if you can go next to the next slide, I'll explain a little bit what that is. Okay, cool. Thank you. So there's several parts to this because this is so complicated. So the myth of the Aleph is actually a short story written by George Louis Borges. So the image that we saw prior, that was him standing, and it was kind of an iconic image. It's actually, yeah. So if you can go, yeah, thank you. So the Aleph is actually an object, okay, and it refers to, quote, a small bound object that expands into an infinity of spectacles, and the experiencer could therefore devote a lifetime to its contemplation. Okay, so it's one of those mythical things. It's a fiction, and it's basically people get sucked into this Aleph. They look at it and they look at infinite possibilities. That's why it's so fascinating. So Ryan uses that as an analogy to discuss hypertext. Okay, so she says that the concept of the hypertext is strikingly similar to the concept of the Aleph. So she's not saying that the theorists who are doing hypertext, you know, borrow the idea from Borges, but she certainly see really similarities between the two. So hypertext theorists argue that the hypertext is a textual object that can offer infinite non-linear narrative possibilities. So non-linear means that it doesn't have to follow a temporal order. Okay, so story can go all over the place. My movie references is going to be a bit dated, but it has. I'm thinking that some of us must have seen Pulp Fiction, right? Pulp Fiction is one of those classic films that are non-linear, and it doesn't follow. So you are placed into the film, and what we call that's called in media res, which means in the middle of things. So you have no idea how the story began or how the story ends. You're kind of rushed into the middle, and you're trying to figure out what the heck happened. So that would be an example of a non-linear story. And in Pulp Fiction, the story jumped all over the place in time. So the viewer, after watching it, probably maybe watch it once or twice, try to gather, like a puzzle, exactly what happened and piece that in a temporal order for themselves. Okay, but hypertext is kind of like Pulp Fiction, which is it's non-linear, it refuses to follow that temporal order. And in that sense, the hypertext theorists say that that's why you can have unlimited, infinite narrative possibilities due to this nonlinearity. So, and here's a question from Jerry.
Yes.
Yeah. So the theory of narrative process is self a medium. So I guess the question is, what exactly is a medium, So medium is a framing, okay? And it works as a framing. I don't know if theory, you can say theory is a framing, but it's a framing in which meaning is affected. Meaning is expressed through it. So content is expressed through this thing. So I'm not sure we can conflate the two, but it's certainly an interesting question. Yeah.
If I may add.
Yeah.
As far as medium goes, I mean, when we were talking about this specific narrative, you were saying about digital media. And
Yeah.
I mean, the really powerful thing about digital media is that it comes in lots of forms. There's no real set way on how it exists or how you interact with it. There's no set of rules. Like, I could be watching a video right now, and as they're talking, I could be researching. I could pause. I could leave. I could research topics. I could chat with other people. I could share this with other people. I could discuss this in various different forms, and I think that's where it's really getting at, because it is nonlinear, proving that there is no set way of interacting with this medium. Is that correct?
Yeah, very interesting you brought that up. I would say, yeah, some digital media, you can say some of it's nonlinear. I agree with you there. But in terms of rules, digital media operate under procedural rhetoric because in order to make any kind of software, you need to use computational rules to generate it. So there's definitely rules that's operating under any software. In fact, once you get into an environment, for example, we are using Google Hangout, and there are certain rules to Google Hangout that we have to learn in order to learn the software. So each software has its own set of rules. But sometimes when you use different kind of software, you find innovation because you implement different kind of rules to give you a different experience. So I would say that there's still rules, but certainly I can agree with you that some software give you a sense of non-linearity, and that's what makes it interesting.
I think it's the audience interaction becomes non-linear.
Right.
Yes.
So we can go to the next slide. And thank you. Okay. So the hypertext theorist George Landau. So Ryan brings up George Landau because he's very prominent hypertext theorist. He argues that hypertext is a textual object that reconfigures the text at the discourse level and at the plot level. So discourse is the object already there, okay? We're not talking about the conceptual level now. So since hypertext provides a non-linear narrative, the reader would be able to construct infinite number of discourses and plots by engaging with the hypertext. So depending on where you click, depending on the choices that you make, you have different kind of plot point that you're making for yourself. And in that sense, Landau argues that yes, hypertext give you unlimited, infinite number of discourses and plots. So next. Thank you. So Ryan points out Landau because she wants to critique it. So she says Landau's claim is problematic. She argues that logic, time, and causality matter in the sequence of a plot, and that the sequence helps make a narrative coherent. So when we say a narrative is coherent to it, that means we understand it because it follows a logical order. So when you take a narrative out of that order, logic, time, and causality, which are elements for making a coherent narrative, are disconnected, and thus the entire narrative meaning is lost as well. So she's she's skeptical of this idea that if you play with hypertext, that the reader would be able to generate serious numbers of new narratives, and they understand each narrative meaning. Because she said, well, if you dislocate the story parts and you move the plot around, it's very difficult to understand the narrative. So it's no longer coherent. And she also said that the reader would have to piece together desperate pieces to make meaning or sense of the hypertext nonlinear plot. Okay, so and go next, please. Okay, thank you. So also she suspects that readers would have a very difficult time with interpreting nonlinear hypertext, much less consider each reading of a hypertext as a new story. So again, she says, if it seems utopian to expect of readers to be able to provide missing links to connect segments in a narratively meaningful way for each different order of appearance, the Alephic conception of a new story with each reading becomes untenable. So she's talking about the object, the myth of the Aleph, the idea that hypertext can produce infinite amount of stories. She thinks that that's a problem, because if you're breaking the coherence of the narrative, you're not really making new stories, you're just breaking it up in that sense. So please go next. Okay. So she argues that actually readers don't see a hypertext as a series of new stories, but they just look at it as puzzles that should be and can be solved. So here's the quote from her. She says, "What we have instead is something much closer to the narrative equivalent of a jigsaw puzzle. Just as we can work for a time on a puzzle, leave it, and come back to it later, readers of hypertext do not start a new story from scratch every time they open the program, but rather construe a mental representation over many sessions, completing or amending the picture put together so far." So I brought up Pulp Fiction as an example because when I watched Pulp Fiction the first time, maybe because I'm slow or not paying attention, I wasn't clear on exactly what the temporal order of the plot was. So it took me about second or maybe the third watch to understand exactly of the four sequence of story, which happened first, which happened second, which happened third, which happened fourth. So for Ryan, she's arguing that basically when you encounter a hypertext, you're not really thinking of it as, oh, a series of new stories. You're really thinking of it as a giant puzzle that you're trying to figure out. And you have to play with it several times in order to understand the complete picture of what the hypertext is trying to say. Next. Okay, so we covered the Aleph, and now I'm going to talk about the second type of narrative myth, which she calls the holodeck. Okay, and I couldn't find the holodeck, but that was one of the Kill Screen magazine virtual reality edition. So that's that image right there. So if we can go next.
It's a very wonderful GIF picture, by the way.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Okay. So the myth of the holodeck. Okay. So the holodeck, I think most of us are familiar with Star Trek. I suspect our book club, most of us are familiar with Star Trek or Star Wars. The holodeck refers to that virtual reality space or cave on the Enterprise, which is a starship in the TV show Star Trek. The cave creates a fictional virtual 3D simulation that allows visitor to play a fictional character within its environment. The interactivity between humans and simulated virtual characters and the simulated environments help instantly generate the plot. So in that sense, and this came from Janet H. Murray, which I'll talk in just a sec there, but the idea that it's interactive fiction in the holodeck because you play a character, and the way the plot is going to unfold depends on how you interact with character and environment that's generated in the holodeck. So it creates narrative that way. Next.
I think there should be a lot of Trekkies here. So, and if not, they should think of maybe Oculus Rift for those that aren't around for Star Trek, because it does have that virtual reality component, which is gives you that surround, that immersive feeling.
Right. Exactly. Right. Yeah. We can go next there. Okay. So Janet H. Murray, she wrote the famous book Hamlet on the holodeck. Okay. And she argues that, quote, the holodeck, like any literary experience, is potentially valuable in exactly this way. It provides a safe place in which to confront disturbing feelings we would otherwise suppress. It allows us to recognize our most threatening fantasies without becoming paralyzed by them. So this quote here is what Ryan take issue with. She broke the entire quote apart. Even though it sounds great, Ryan says that there are lots of assumptions underneath this quote this argument that we really need to flesh out to understand what the problem is. Okay. So next, if you would, please. Okay. So here's a couple of quotes here. So she says, Ryan's argument, the viability of the concept of the holodeck as model of digital narrative is questionable for a number of reasons. So she pointed out there are three factors: technological, algorithmic, and above all, psychological. So problem one, she discussed the technological, and it kind of conflicts with the algorithmic, okay? So Ryan points out that true VR, virtual reality immersion, where the player loses him or herself in VR, requires an artificial intelligence that will automatically construct a plot based on users' unpredictable actions. So the idea, going back to Star Trek's holodeck, it seems that the environment would generate plot points for the user. So you don't have to say, you don't always have to tell the holodeck exactly how the story can go, even though you can choose, right? So it's an artificial intelligence generating the plot points. And in this sense, the AI would serve as a story-generating system. And she argues that, well, our current VR technology really doesn't allow this to happen. This is very far-fetched for Ryan. She said, it sounds great, but in order for you to argue that the holodeck, right, that this holodeck analogy can give us that true unlimited narrative, there are certain things that need to happen, and our technology can't get us there yet. Okay, next. Okay, the next problem is the psychological. So Ryan also questioned Murray's claim that the holodeck can, and quote again, allow us to recognize our most threatening fantasies without becoming paralyzed by them. And for Ryan, this is a really big problem. This idea that, you know, we can have catharsis when we get into the holodeck, you know, the psychological effect of doing things in virtual environment that we otherwise would not be able to do in reality, catharsis, right? But Ryan says that basically the VR experience may actually be psychologically straining, even traumatizing for the player or interactor to play a main character in the holodeck. Since being the main character can expose one to greater psychological harm, such as actually mentally sensing or experiencing pain, torment, anguish, depression, guilt, etc. Okay, so she says, actually, if you play someone, okay, place someone actually in the holodeck and let them experience whatever they want, well, the holodeck is supposed to, and Chris, you correct me if I'm wrong, okay, but it's supposed to be a virtual novel, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, doesn't it play out like virtual novels? And I remember there's an episode.
Yeah.
Right. And I remember there was like an episode where, was it Captain Luc Picard? He was playing Sherlock Holmes, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So they were playing out classic literature in the holodeck, and they want to kind of experience the condition of that time, I think. But
yes, and Moriarty tried to escape.
Say again, Chris?
I said, and Moriarty tried to escape, of course.
Oh, yes. Yes. Yeah. So in that sense, though, she is saying, how horrifying would it be if we actually play main characters in classic literary novels in this holodeck? Because the main characters of any book experience most trauma. I mean, they experience danger. Oh, yeah. Go ahead, please.
Oh, actually, I think that part of what she's saying here really has to be looked at now in the lens of the research that's been done. Okay, and here's why. What she's talking about now, and it's not the Star Trek holodeck, but in the virtual worlds, there's things like and probably Blue and Chris both know it, virtual hallucinations. It's actually a setup where you're supposed to experience what someone who is schizophrenic would experience, you know, the voices, the whispering, and the things like that. And actually, it's been used educationally for psychology. And the other part, and I'd love to have Krista chime in here too, is that we did a simulation of Bardo Tolo, which is the soul going from the soul having to go ahead and find its way out instead of being condemned on the wheel of life again and finding and being given to one of the realms. Now the thing about that is we had our students come in and they played the role. We had them. And they didn't get to bring their own avatars. We had an avatar, just a very, very blank avatar that kind of looked like Gandhi, if anything, right? And we had them come and play through that role, and they had to deal with the wrathful deities and the peaceful deities and everything like that. It was about a 15 or 20-minute simulation. I mean, we had lots of different results, but the essays we got, which was the purpose, it was the essays we got were really fantastic. And I mean, I can see. Right, I mean, I can see where you can have a bad experience, but I can definitely see built correctly, a simulation could give a very positive experience also.